Welcome to Ethics Matter. I'm Stephanie Tsai, and our guest is Steven Cohen, the Executive Director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Steven has an extensive resume, not all of which I will recall here. Suffice it to say, you have a rich background in environmental policy, in public management, and today we are going to be talking about the sustainable future. Steven has what I would say a rare positive perspective on the future of our planet. So I want to focus on your thinking around that. Thank you so much for joining us. I watched a talk you gave in 2015 titled A Positive Vision of the Transition to Sustainability. That was 2 years ago, before we had an administration stacked with climate change skeptics. Are you changing your tune on that? Do you need to come out with a new talk?
No, I still believe that we're heading toward a renewable resource-based economy, and I think that it's inevitable. It would be better if we had a president that was supportive of those goals and whose thinking had advanced since the mid-1970s, but unfortunately that's not what we have. But it really doesn't matter. Companies, people, communities, local governments, they're all moving in the same direction. So that was a talk I gave at the Ross School out in the Hamptons. And they were taking their whole year and devoting it to sustainability studies. And this was the kickoff of helping their teachers get ready for that year. And nothing since then has changed my view, including the last several months.
All right, I want to delve into some of the reasons you feel that businesses and local governments are on a path towards sustainability, but I want to press you just a little bit further on the current administration, because a lot of people that care about climate change were up in arms after the Trump administration decided to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords. How do you view that action through, first, a policy lens, and then through a moral lens?
It was an unethical act by the president, without question. We have a responsibility to the rest of the world. We're the leading economy. We should be playing a leadership role on these issues of global sustainability, particularly climate change. So I think it was a mistake, and it was an immoral act. There's no question about that. But I think that, fortunately, we live in a country with many sources of power. The president may be the single most powerful person, but we're a federal system. States have enormous power. Cities get that power from the states, and corporations and communities have a lot of power. We're a federal system. And so the president moving in one direction is bad. The first thing that you saw afterwards was a group of people led by Mike Bloomberg to universities and states and cities and corporations all saying we're still in.
Right.
And actually asking the UN to let us represent this country for the greenhouse gas goals, which we're going to meet anyway.
Mm-hmm. You wrote in an article in the Huffington Post recently, quote, President Trump and his pals deny the importance of climate change, but they have inadvertently mobilized America's businesses, states, cities, and civil society to engage even more intensely in mitigating climate change and in building a renewable resource-based economy. Very similar to what you just said. What makes you say that? And beyond these companies saying we will continue to follow these pledges?
Well, part of the reason this is happening is that it's in our self-interest. It's not just an altruistic act. First, moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy is going to create a less expensive, a less costly way of generating energy.
And a lot of that is because renewables have become more affordable than fossil fuels in some cases.
Think about it this way. The source of energy from the sun is never going to cost us anything. And so receiving that energy and storing it will get cheaper and cheaper as the technology advances. It's the same thing we saw with computers. Computers used to be big and slow and expensive, and now we carry them around in our pocket. The smartphone I carry in my pocket has more computing power than the mainframe I used in graduate school.
The huge IBM
processor. Right, with people with white coats and air conditioners. So that's going to happen to renewable energy. Now, fossil fuels, you're going to always have to extract out of the ground, and you're always going to have to ship it to where you're using it. That's expensive. So just looking at the 20, 30, 40-year horizon, anybody looking at technology and looking at cost curves says, this transition's already underway, and it's just going to pick up momentum. There's going to be a tipping point where it's going to be so much cheaper and so much more convenient, people are going to wonder why they ever bothered with fossil fuels.
I think the smartphone analogy is particularly apt when we talk about you saying it doesn't matter that the federal government has pulled out of Paris. It doesn't matter that they are not making this a priority, because smartphones, that wasn't driven by government regulation or federal government doing anything.
Right. Well, it actually, they did deregulate, they broke up AT&T, for example, into the regional bells. And there was some government action, but no, in general, a lot of change is over the 20th century, a lot of economic change into the 21st century is technological. Technology has transformed how we live, and the technology affects economics and culture and society. I mean, New York City is a great example. After World War II, almost half of the GDP of this city was in manufacturing clothing. Mm-hmm. Now it's less than 2%. Mm-hmm. What happened? Well, part of it is containerized shipping was too big for New York City's docks on the west side. Where the High Line is, that was a freight train from the docks to the factories. Mm-hmm. Those factories are all gone. The docks are all gone. They're all in New Jersey because that's where the containerized port is. Mm-hmm. So what happened? We went through a decade, almost 2 decades of economic misery in this city. We almost went bankrupt. And now that part of Manhattan is filled with high-end everything. And so those changes were not made by government.
This sounds like a very capitalistic view. Mm-hmm.
We're in a global economy that's driven by capitalism.
Which is interesting, because I've heard environmentalists say, after the Trump administration pulled out of Paris, well, this is one thing that an authoritarian government like China can get right. They can make renewable energy happen. And what you're saying is really at odds with that.
Well, I mean, first of all, people keep playing the war between the communists and the capitalists like it's still going on. So the war is over. Both sides won. You go to China, it's one of the most capitalist countries in the world. We have a mixed economy, and it's a continuum. Now, you do have authoritarian and democratic regimes, and the Chinese regime is authoritarian. But talking about the economic side of things, there's a mix of collective and individual in every society.
When we talk about China and India, which are the most populous China by far the most polluting country in the world, you also talk about the fact that they can see the pollution. They can see and feel. I was based in Beijing for a couple of years as a journalist, and there were days where I felt like I needed to wear a face mask, and that's putting real political pressure for them to go toward renewables. That's not happening in this country.
Well,
we haven't had that kind of pollution for decades.
Because the Clean Air Act, which is how we're going to regulate greenhouse gases, by the way, that's the other fact. When George W. Bush was president, a bunch of states' attorney generals sued the EPA, sued the federal government to have greenhouse gases declared under the 1970 Clean Air Act as a dangerous pollutant. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court said, yes, it is. And the Clean Power Plan was the Obama administration's effort to finally issue that regulation. Now, President Trump and Administrator Pruitt may pull it back, but they've got to then promulgate another regulation.
Right. What is your sense of the federal government, of what the role of the federal government should be? You were at the EPA, for example, and EPA regulations beyond the Clean Power Plan, the safety of drinking water, toxins in the air and in our environment. Isn't that where the federal government does need to play a role?
It's important for them to play a role, particularly for interstate pollution. In other words, pollution that comes from Ohio and goes to New Jersey, or from Arizona to California, or something like that. But in fact, one of the reasons why we passed the Clean Air Act and the Water Pollution Control Act in the early 70s is we were worried that states would compete for dirty businesses. Now, there's a counterforce which has come up because of the 1980s, and the redefinition of the environmental problem is a health problem. In the 70s and earlier, people thought, well, the environment, it's an aesthetics issue. We care about nature, we want to preserve the planet because it's a good thing to do. Well, it turns out it's not just a good thing to do, it's necessary for your health, that you can actually get sick and die from pollution. So a lot of the political pressure for environmental protection comes from the ground up now. We have trouble in New York citing a big box store. Nobody's going to try to attract a dirty business into this place, or pretty much any state. Nobody wants it near them. Even states that have big economic problems don't want smoke belching factories.
Talk to me about your thoughts on nuclear, and because that seems to be a point of division among environmentalists. Some who believe this is the solution, this is zero carbon for the most part.
Well, many of my colleagues think that. Many climate scientists think that. I don't, for several reasons. Well, first of all, I'm a political scientist, so I think more about the politics and the management issues. So France, for example, is highly dependent on nuclear, but they have a very different political structure than we have, very centralized, and they've been able to handle it up till now. I mean, I worked for a little while as a consultant to the nuclear waste program. We don't have a repository. We've done a lot of work toward opening one, but the senators in Nevada won't allow it to happen. Why? Because at this point, there's so much nuclear waste accumulated in the civilian plants that when you start shipping it, it's all going to come to one point in Yucca Mountain, and somewhere, mathematically, it's almost inevitable there'll be an accident of some kind. So I don't like the waste. I think the technology, I mean, nuclear technology could have eventually become a useful technology, particularly if they had advanced fusion. If you could come up with a nuclear power that couldn't be made into a bomb and didn't create a dangerous toxic waste, that might be worth exploring. And I think someday that probably will happen. But we, for political reasons, went to nuclear too soon, and the nuclear power that we have, I don't think I think it has some properties which are not very good.
What about technologies such as carbon capture? What I'm trying to get is just, after I ask you to comment on each of this, is just sort of your broader view of where renewables are heading and your views on things like the carbon tax. So what about carbon capture?
So carbon capture and storage, because you have to capture it and then you have to store it, is something that we will have to do, because we've already accumulated too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
Like if we don't start taking carbon out that we've already created, we're going to be on a path toward what?
Well, we're going to be altering the climate, which we've already done, but more than probably our ecosystem should be tolerating. Again, a lot of climate change is natural. A lot of it is human-made. We know the difference. At least our scientists at the Earth Institute know the difference and have been analyzing that. We have over 100 people in the Earth Institute working just on those issues. But we have a group also working on taking the carbon from the atmosphere and turning it into something else. I mean, one of the more promising technologies is turning it into a solid. You could turn it into paving material. Those kinds of things are possible. And we are going to have to do a lot more research and development and figure out how to do that. That's not going to be something that the market will ever pay for.
Right.
That's going to be something that government is going to have to do.
Yeah, and I want to get into that towards the end of this talk about how, again, the political situation at the federal level may actually affect the Earth Institute. But a few more questions about renewable energy, because I have read that you do not support a carbon tax.
Right.
And a lot of your colleagues, I know at the Sabin Center and other areas within Columbia, they are for a carbon tax as sort of sending a market signal to raise the price of fossil fuel use.
Right. And the idea is then that makes renewable energy more cost effective.
Right.
I'd rather go directly to the renewable energy and make it cheaper. I would rather, see, part of the problem is that by putting a tax on something, particularly in the political environment we're in now, you're now going to be saying to people, you're going to be paying more for your energy. Now, energy is not equally distributed. Poor people put a whole lot more of their income into energy than rich people do. And so they will be affected. Well, then they say, well, we'll give them back the money.
Some sort of dividend.
Yeah. But that's the problem with that is unless you're giving it to them immediately, it doesn't do that much good. You need something like the earned income tax credit coming in their paycheck, every week or every couple of weeks. And
well, that's been proposed.
Yeah, it's possible. The reason why people are so attracted to the carbon tax and pricing carbon is that economics is a very powerful discipline, and our climate scientists like the math. It's an elegant solution. A carbon tax is an elegant solution. Theoretically, I understand it, and you can chart the impact of price on behavior, but there is also some price indifference on the use of energy. In other words, I've got to go to work with my car. And I'm a working person. My car doesn't get such great gas mileage. And I can't invest in the hybrid or the electric car, so I'm stuck. And I worry about that part of it. But what I'm really worried about more than anything else is that it's an indirect way to push renewables. I would rather go directly to fund the science and technology, have renewables drive fossil fuels out of the marketplace. So at the beginning of the 20th century, the biggest environmental problem we had in New York City was horse manure. We were knee-deep in it because the horse was the main way of transporting people before we got the subway, before we got the internal combustion engine. Well, nobody taxed the horse. They just made a car that drove the horse from the marketplace. Cars were cheaper, more convenient, and better technology.
Right.
Okay? So what I'm saying is we don't need to raise the price of the bad technology. Let's lower the price, make renewable energy cheaper, more convenient, and more reliable than fossil fuels, and you won't have to tax fossil fuels.
So you're talking about that from a research and development, further develop renewable energy so that we can get to a place where it's cheaper. But that's also happening now because of subsidies that are continuing. Congress renewed those subsidies for nuclear is not in there, but wind and solar are. Is that also part of sound policy?
I think that is. I mean, you can use, I would rather use tax expenditures. In other words, if you look at something like the deduction you get on your mortgage and property tax if you own a home. So it turned America from a nation of renters to a nation of owners. That we didn't tax people to rent, we gave people a deduction to buy.
That's also easier to sell.
It's much easier. It's politically much more popular.
Right.
And I think that the politics of this, I mean, environmental politics is what we have to pay attention to. We want to make this popular. Everybody uses energy. So here's the argument. I mean, this is why energy efficiency, by the way, is so politically popular. What's the argument against it? Spend more money, waste energy? What's the argument against cheaper, more reliable, renewable energy? So
the government is a huge procurer, and in all sectors, whether it's the Defense Department, they are using transportation. Are they getting that? Are they moving in the same direction as some of the companies you were talking about are towards green, sustainable energy use?
Well, they were in the previous administration, particularly the military. I mean, the military was moving towards solar in many respects because you can't blow up a solar cell the way you can blow up a tanker. And so it was considered a safer technology to bring and deploy, particularly in the Middle East. And the military is also paying a lot of attention to base vulnerability because of sea level rise.
Sure.
So the issue now is whether, under this administration, which is guided by ideology and fantasy, whether the facts of climate change are going to still be part of the management of the federal government.
The reason I ask that is I want to delve deeper into, companies, and I know a number of, I think about 50% of Fortune 100 companies, as well as many Fortune 500 companies, have set these science-based sustainability targets. Are they enough to really make a dent? And this includes, big companies like Walmart and Microsoft.
Walmart is a leader because not only do they do it for themselves, but they require their suppliers to demonstrate the sustainability of their supply chain. Now, what's interesting about that is, I mean, they're doing it because it makes for less expensive things to sell in Walmart.
Right.
In other words, sustainability also means I'm paying attention to my use of water, my use of materials, my use of energy, and the environmental impact of what I'm doing. And one of the reasons why you want to pay attention to the environmental impact is that if you do something wrong, think of companies like Volkswagen or BP, the bill can be billions and billions of dollars.
That also gets to cultural change. And I understand part of your optimism is a belief that there is sort of, I don't know if that's how you would describe it, but that was my interpretation of things you had written, that you sense there is a real cultural change that these companies are addressing, that younger generations who polls show do care more about climate change. They want to buy products that they believe are sustainably manufactured.
All the polling about millennials say that this is important to them. And this is going to be the dominant force in the marketplace. It's already starting, and it's just going to get larger. So that's one piece of it. I think the younger generation has grown up understanding that we're in a more crowded world. I mean, look, when I grew up, there were 3 billion people on the planet. Today, there's 7.5 billion people. People know. They get, young people in particular get the idea. I read applications for my programs from students in China, and they're totally motivated by, the river used to be, blue and now it's orange, and the air, used to be blue and now it's gray, and people understand that. And I think because of the internet, because of the web, because of smartphones, these images are shared globally and instantaneously. So everybody knows how bad the air is in Beijing. I mean, we had air that was just as bad in Pittsburgh, it was just as bad in LA, but we didn't have the global media that we have today. And so people kind of knew, but they didn't know the way you know about the air in Beijing. But at the same time, there's something else going on. I have a new book coming out next fall called The Sustainable City, and I have a chapter on sustainable lifestyles. So what are you seeing also? Well, you're seeing the sharing economy. You're seeing lower levels of car ownership now in this part of the world. And people, the culture is shifting to not accumulating stuff, but experiencing and using stuff. And so because of the internet, again, you can now use a car for 2 hours a day, where 20 years ago that would have been impossible. The paperwork alone would have taken more time than it would have been worth. So we're starting to see the beginning of a sharing economy in many different aspects. So it's the nature of consumption is changing. I mean, one of the examples I often use is, 20 years ago, you'd go to Blockbuster and rent a video. You'd bring it home. It would be a physical thing. It came in wrapping. It had to be shipped.
I remember Blockbuster.
Right. So today, you flip a switch, and streaming comes over. There's no material consumption at all. It's just energy. And if that energy is renewable, you are consuming. It's adding to the GDP just like Blockbuster did, but it's not using any physical good. So you're beginning to see an economy that is transitioning. There's going to be a lot more people participating in that economy. China and India are the two places that have the most people in the world. Their consumption is going up. And the question is, can we develop this renewable resource-based economy in time to keep those billions of people from destroying the planet?
I want to talk about that notion of time, which you've mentioned a couple times now, because they're among those that were at COP21 and among a lot of scientists who care about the environment, who study it, there seems to be a real sense of urgency that I'm not sensing from you. And yet you have said a couple of times, we don't really know whether we're going to be able to develop renewable energy technologies and batteries and carbon capture quickly enough. What assumptions are you working on? I mean, you have access to some of the best scientists in the world on this stuff at the Earth Institute.
Well, the technologies are uncertain, but I know people are working on, battery technology is a major emphasis in our engineering school. It's a major emphasis in all of the engineering schools that I know of, the top schools. I mean, imagine nanotechnology applied to batteries and solar cells. So instead of the solar array being $20,000 on your roof, It's $300 and it's on your window. And the battery, instead of it being the size of your wall, is the size of your laptop.
I mean, I can imagine that, just given how even in my lifetime I've
Right.
seen so many advances. But are you confident that these technologies will be deployed quickly enough to avoid potentially catastrophic effects of climate change?
I believe they will be, largely because I think it's so important and so many people are working on it that, and we've already seen the prices starting to come down. We're not at that tipping point. We're not at the point yet where people are saying, I'm going to disconnect from the grid. But I'll tell you, I used to ask my students all the time, how many of you have landlines in your apartments or dorm rooms? And you know, when I first started to ask, half, two-thirds, then I don't even ask the question anymore. A few years ago, it went to 0. So they disconnected. When that happens to electricity, imagine when electricity becomes so inexpensive, you know, if your home renewable energy kit costs you $500, period, costs you $300, why connect to the grid?
Right.
Especially if your battery is really reliable. And is that going to happen? Absolutely, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Now, the reason we'll need the grid is big institutions, factories, probably won't be able to generate the energy they need, but who knows what that'll be like in 50 years. But I do think the technologies are coming. What I'm saying is I don't know what they're going to look like and how fast they're going to come, but I think that I do see these as pretty much on the way.
Steven Cohen, I really appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.